Hello, everyone. Today I am with Cheryl Hsu, and Cheryl is a transition designer and a speculative researcher. And I first came across you, Cheryl. I saw a project, a research project you're doing on oracular bodies. So maybe we can speak about that soon. But Cheryl, I mainly wanted to speak to you. Well, welcome, firstly.
Thank you.
I wanted to speak to you mainly about to have a conversation about the soul and the sacred and the mystery, and then perhaps we can talk a little bit about your project as well. So, but I wonder whether could we start just with some of the, you know, main influences and turning points for you. How did you get on this soul making path? Just a small question to start with.
Mm. It feels connected to how we started this conversation, which for me is an invitation and a request for an attunement to a quality, a posture of attention that brings me very intimate with soul. And often when I drop into a silence that another also says yes to. So there's this very subtle dance that actually happens in silence for me. There's a sense of a connection to a field between us, like almost like a third space in the middle. And it's always a surprise what ends up arising. And some of this is, yeah, it's rooted in my meditation practice. I do, and I want to share more because this lineage of soul making dharma, which is sourced by Burbea, is a really vital lineage in the way that I practice and work with the imaginal realm and with soul. But the way that I relationally engage immediately with another, because it's not something I simply do on a pillow during a morning meditation sit. It's something that I actually want to activate in any living connection, any conversation, if someone's willing to dance and meet me there. But yeah, in that even brief, perhaps 1 or 2 minute long silence, there's a way in which the imaginal can arise as like a felt sense of image. And in this case, perhaps it's because there's a kind of return to the beginning in how I was introduced to soul. I actually saw a portal, a kind of, it's like a corkscrew staircase along the walls of a very ancient well.
Uh,
And
Sorry,
a
can
very,
you Bell?
it corkscrews like a kind of spiral staircase along the wall, like a stone wall of a very ancient well.
Right.
And when I was probably, this was 4 or 5 years ago now in 2020, when I was starting to practice, like that was my portal, that was my doorway. I would often see, and this really wasn't with any kind of background in archetypal imagery yet. Like
Yeah.
I was just really with the kind of raw
It just
phenomena.
it just spontaneously came up in basically.
Exactly. Yeah,
Right.
and it was kind of amazing to then learn afterwards and constellate. Oh, there's a whole, yeah, constellation of the meaning of the well.
Yeah.
And yeah, I actually kind of return back to it. And there's a sense of soul always has this quality of descent. and depth, like a catabasis, and a way in which I'm deepening more and more into the roots. And the way the image would also arise is like there's thickening roots that begin to, it's almost like crawl and really be filling up the whole space.
That's very Carl Jungish, by the way. You know, the what did he call it? The rhizome, the roots going down into the rhizome, you know, and
Mm.
it was his image. I think it's in the beginning of memory streams and reflections. That's a major thing for him. Mm.
Beautiful. Yeah, the roots and rhizomes are, that feels very alive to me. To the point where I was considering rhizome as a name for, for my child, actually. Um,
And
but yeah.
can I say one other thing? When you were saying that, I was also thinking of, you know, the Greeks have that word, the temenos, and
Hmm.
often, you know, like it was like there was the sacred space. It was often a walled garden with the well where people and the kind of what is it? There's the secular world or the you know the profane world was kind of without, but people went and sat next to the well. So it's kind of like that. Oh, sometimes I get it like a space to go to where you know you go back to the origins, you go back to the depths, you go back to that those kind of sacred feelings or whatever.
Hmm. Yes.
Mm.
Yes, and it's really, yeah, because when I started my meditation practice, which was very much, I mean, I was meditating here and there, but the kind of devotion of it, the sense of feeling called to sit, to be with silence, which was out of character for me in certain ways too. Like I'm a very active person, and to learn to be with sacred silence was something that was actually, it was instructed to me when I was camping on an island in 2020, and I was sitting on a rock and I was drawing. I was drawing the trees. And I had this very, very kind of like felt sense of instruction from my ancestors, um, that I was to just sit in silence, like really cultivate a sense of discipline with my awareness and my attention. And I remember they were guiding me. They were guiding my hand to draw exactly. It was very precise. It was like, draw exactly what you see. Like your work now is to see as perfectly as possible. And after that camping trip, like I took that instruction very seriously. It was very, it's not something I do very often. It was quite new, but this one was just so clear that that was when I actually decided to do a 3-month monastic retreat and left my job and told my partner and my parents, like, I know this is very strange, but I really, like, it's time for me to actually retreat and be in my own world.
And what did they say, Cheryl? What did they
It
say?
felt, I mean, I think
Did
because
they
of
freak
like
out?
that's this like the disruption of COVID is really interesting because it it completely kind of shifted what was normal. And because I think at that point I had started something that I called my soul-directed master's degree. So I was doing a lot of my own self-directed learning journey. And then so I kind of had this like, uh, yeah, it wasn't quite like belligerent, but it was like a real sense of soul authorship around it. Like, I must go do this 3-month retreat. I know it sounds strange. Um, and there was some resistance from like just little bits of judgment and resistance, like, why are you doing this? But ultimately, I think there was like a clarity in my disposition that they trusted. And yeah, I ended up going into a, yeah, kind of a monastic setting that was also a bit of a social experiment for 3 months, not too far away from home, just about 3 hours away. And all like mostly what I did there was follow a kind of Zen monastic schedule of waking up at 4:30 every morning, chanting, meditating, mostly being in mo noble silence. And that was when that was when like little cracks and openings into the imaginal realm had been present for me before, but that was my deep dive. Like there was a certain kind of, I mean, when you speak of temenos, like there's a whole sense of being in that retreat for 3 months was as though I was in like a like I was in a kairos. I was in a completely different temporal place. And yeah, and that's when it felt like I was apprenticing. And this is where I was listening to the Dharma talks of Robert Bea as well.
Can
He
you
was like,
can you just tell us who Robert Bayer is for a second?
yeah,
I think I've heard the name, but I really don't know much about him.
so Robert Bea, he is an insight Dharma teacher who was trained in the kind of Zen insight tradition. And he actually passed away in, I believe, 2019. So when I encountered him, he had just freshly left this world. But what was very, like, what was incredibly innovative about his work was, I think actually around the time that he realized that he had pancreatic cancer, he was diagnosed with cancer. Um, he was also essentially sourcing this new Dharma that he called soul-making Dharma. And it was very much informed by this real kind of sense of like devote, like I think he just like was almost electrified by this duty to needing, like wanting to bring an aliveness back to traditional Dharma practice, and to rather than see desire as something to be overcome or to be like not trusted, um, actually invite like the creative capacities of eros and like the deep connection with soul into relationship with the dharma of emptiness and seeing through. And he was really influenced by by reading James Hillman, by the work of Henry Corbin, and like real. And so a lot of his, like he recorded thousands and thousands of hours of retreat Dharma talks and was just describing this whole lattice of ways in which through meditation practice and cultivating energy body awareness, one can actually bring themselves into, through longing, through eros, into a kind of relating with the imaginal realm. And it was really, I mean, it was remarkable. And it was also, a lot of people saw his Dharma as dangerous, actually, too provocative.
Well, I think throughout the whole of history that eros has been seen as a dangerous thing, maybe. And when you were talking, I was thinking of like in India, there are what saints and sadhus and rishis, and sometimes there's a very, what is it, an ascetic practice of kind of world
Mhm.
denying or whatever. But in a lot of people I'm seeing at the moment, and I can think of Bayo Akomolafe, I would put him in this category, is there's that the way the language is used, it's full of eros and intimacy and richness and desire and longing and all of those things, which is so, um, I would say, it's kind of a voluptuous language, which is enticing. I mean, for a lot of people, like the ascetic path, the world denying path, that's what I would call maybe a duty, or it's how we're viewed religious things sometimes or whatever. But to to enter into an engagement which is full and rich, that
Mm,
that is something else.
yes. And I love that you bring up Bayo Akomolafe because he was also the two, yeah, the two folks who would be the most intimate guides on the path of soul making for me have been actually Rob Burbea and Bayo Akomolafe. And it was Bayo's course, like the exposure to his work, and his course, There Will Be Mountains, which We Will Dance with Mountains, which I took also at the beginning of COVID. It was so voluptuous is exact. It's such the right word for it. There's like a teemingness, like an aliveness to
Mm,
his cosmology and to the way that he invites us to be with paradox and the kind of divinity and monstrosity of being alive in this very, very entangled world. And I remember just there was something again, it's just there was such a an allurement to his work. It's like there's like something in whatever he's transmitting that even
yeah,
through the
yeah.
kind of it felt so
Language,
esoteric and like riddled and kind of like metaphorical, but there was something there that I could feel like just was wanting to kind of like almost seed in me through him. And
yeah.
like at times it felt like there was kind of like monstrosity that was being born in me through exposures to these kind of like, yeah,
I,
little,
I, I think they're not just. I don't know. I'm just speaking about Bayer now, but I think Carl Jung said becoming enlightened is not just about imagining figures of light or whatever. And somehow with Bayer, it's like he's slippery trickster part of him is that he takes you into the dark, into the cracks at the same time as there's this voluptuous language that both things are happening. So it's like the light and the dark are being opened.
exactly.
Mm,
And something that I so deeply appreciate about where Rob Burbea as a teacher kind of weaves it is he weaves the kind of voluptuousness, like the kind of voluptuous fabrication of reality, the way the soul, through its longing, through its desiring, is able to create and manifest and birth worlds. But then he also he works with this like way of seeing through as well. It's like everything is just a way of seeing. You can't literalize or grasp onto or cling onto a particular image. There's a
mm,
way in which yeah, there's a way in which he can also see through the transparency of the archetypal and the mythopoetic as well. And I think that's where I felt really drawn to the balance of the discernment and the clarity, the kind of clarified, you could say, like quote unquote, awakened seeing. But then with this, then, okay, yes, everything is empty, but what are we here and alive to do in this world? We've made a soul contract to be alive together and to create and to be kind of fecund in our aliveness during our time in this kind of in our mortal life. And there's something about just like allowing my meditation sits to be like encounters with divinities and to allow that to feel normal. And in fact, actually within its own, yeah, within its own metaphysical transparency, also like a way that I'm engaging with reality. That was really powerful. And and continues to be, this is like how I communicate with the universe. This is how I communicate with reality.
And in my language, I think, the earth, the body, the nature is, I don't know, there's just this earthy element to spirituality somehow. It's kind of like, I might have had this image of an up the mountain image a little, but it's kind of like this. I know James Hillman says, never go too far away from the pathologies, like stay close to the pathology. It's kind of like, there's something I like about Hillman and Thomas More when they're kind of like even some feeling of depression is a gift. There's something
Mm.
that the soul is somehow speaking through that, or some other feeling which we might consider inferior or whatever. So it's kind of like that groundedness, I think, is maybe the way I'll put it.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, and I imagine my soul my soul descent and connection, like it's like this really intimate, and at times I would call it a love affair. It's like there were so many ways in which I was engaging with kind of psyche and eros, but it like truthfully it felt like more than anything a love affair with myself, with my own soul. And it needed to be born out of tragedy. Like it was really born out of a kind of shattering of an innocence that happened right before COVID, but happened through COVID as well. Like this confrontation with the often unbearable dimensions of reality that like we're just in a kind of culture and climate that's we're so good at shutting out what we don't want to see. We're in these really refined filter bubbles that is of our own making. It's like kind of co-created by our own projections, but it's also very much created by, yeah, many different interests. And for me to really connect with soul as like a way of coming into truth, like I think, and that's something that feels true to me as well. It's like when I open the eye of the soul, I see reality in a way that feels much um, more intimate with what is true. And that means opening up to the pathologies, to the grief, to that which I don't want to see in myself and in the people around me and in the world. And that's why soul work is also it feels like you're being dragged down into the underworld because it's agonizing on some level. Like very human parts of you don't want to confront that. You don't want to feel that pain. Um, but I
Which is
mean,
why we would try to escape it through distraction and entertainment. And I mean, you can understand this, whilst there may be this, oh, well, this is just from my own experience, but it's like, whilst there may be that deep call, there's also this lure of distraction, entertainment, um, uh, keeping away from that path, which is, um, it's a very, what's the word, delicate path to take through the
mm,
soul as well.
yes,
Mm.
yes, and this kind of linking of the, yeah, the kind of the eye of the soul, the seeing through the soul, with also, I mean, and this kind of, to come back to my own journey, it's like in many ways I could actually attribute my soul directed journey to my master's degree, like my actual master's degree in strategic foresight and innovation. And I did my entire master's research project on addiction to technology, essentially, like the way that there's almost this, Yeah, we are being the design of our technologies and our environments are very much in response to actually trying to get at like a kind of shadow longing towards annihilation and like a death drive, really. And it's because it really preys on how painful it is sometimes, actually, very often to be in the world. And so it provides this anesthetizing effect where in this, like I was studying kind of machine gambling in casinos and comparing that to phones and our relationship with social media, but and this was, a decade ago, but
Mm.
I remember it's like my own research journey, started with why is it so hard for me to why is it that every time I felt bad or felt anxious, I just would look at my phone and I felt like
Mm.
I was kind of
Mm.
gripped by this animal body instinct, like I couldn't quite
Yeah.
control my impulses. And then to go into, yeah, the whole systems, the technological systems that are designed with really, really, um, yeah,
They're addictive. I mean,
yeah, and with like really asymmetric kind of like power relationships in order to kind of lull a lot of us into this, yeah, into this way of not being fully present with reality. And the deeper that I went, the more I just realized like how do you break out of this then? How do we teach like young people, especially who are growing up very native to digital culture, to be able to see through it and to be able to reconnect with a kind of inner source of truth and discernment again. And I did not expect that. Like basically my an
yeah,
investigation
that was your
started.
objective research or whatever, and then all of a
Yeah,
sudden, oh
exactly. It
my
was like
God,
step
I'm a
nine and
participant.
yeah, and by the end I was like, oh, and now I think the root of the solution, like, because we're always trying to find solutions or fixes, but I realized it's not any kind of systemic intervention in an exoteric sense. It's actually, it must be rooted in a kind of spiritual, cosmological shift, like in how we relate with ourselves and reality.
Mm.
So I really didn't expect kind of like going into addictive technologies to actually the spiritual posture is where we have to intervene and remember again.
It's like the accident in a way that takes one towards a path, and while you were talking, I was thinking of Persephone in the sense of the journey into the underworld. It's like the loss of innocence, like the death and the rebirth somehow go together. There's some kind of uh, loss that also takes place to allow the rebirth to come, if you want to put it that way.
Mm. Mhm. Yes. It's a Yeah, it's a myth that it's one of the ones that resonates with me and Innana and Ereshkigal Gal as well, just these ways in which one has to almost be stripped down to a kind of death and complete release and surrender of a naive way of being, like something that I've heard framed as like a pre-tragic innocence,
Right.
to move from a pre-tragic innocence into tragedy because you can't bypass that. You still have to. It's like with Innana who goes down to the underworld to see her dark sister. She's completely stripped down, naked, and she's hung on a meat hook at the end and
Mm.
left for dead. And she's like she's the symbol of Venus. Like she's supposed to be the most, yeah, she's majestic and she's hung on a meat hook.
Mm.
Um, But there's something about this journey that where you have to go there to then move to the post-tragic. And I actually still believe in the reclaiming of innocence and hope. Like that's for me still the wellspring of creativity, to dare to dream, to be able to have this way of being in the world that's as though you're a child again,
Yeah.
but it's post-tragic. Like
Yeah.
you can't do that without seeing the world.
I think like in the beginning there's a child, and at the end there's a child, you know, if you want to put it that way. But it's the child on the other side you know, I mean, there's another kind of innocence and um, hope and beauty, but
Hmm.
it's not a
Yeah,
denial, if you want to put it that way.
no, it's true. I
Mm,
mean, that's why there's so many, there's like, the classic image of the Buddha smiling, like childlike, almost
mm,
like a baby. There
mm.
is, yeah, and I love um these images again that arise of play, and laughter and joy as a kind of also radical reclaiming of soul. It's like we are here to be with the whole spectrum of aliveness. We're also not here to be incredibly solemn and ascetic and only do the right thing. So there is like a merriment, like we want to dance, we want to feel, we want to like eat in the world, like consume and be consumed by the world. Um yeah, but there is, I mean, as we're describing, there's like a pre-tragic way of doing that, and then there's a post-tragic way of doing that. And yeah, it's a
Yeah,
subtle difference.
yeah, and it's coming from the soul. Maybe it's kind of like play the trickster a little. Like I don't know. Sometimes I think culturally, you know, there's this underlay of. I remember again another thing Hillman said is, you know, the Puritanism at the beginning of the New World, or the moralism. Like we can look at what's happening in the world and become. It's easy to become a moralist, if you want to put it that way. And this should be fixed, and that shouldn't happen, and da da da. But it's almost like in the child part of it, in the trickster part of it, it's like there's just this. It, it's not so much a moralism; it's more of the joy, the play, the leela, the those kinds of things which are um, coming back.
Yes. Yeah. And I remember in our first encounter, I was talking about how my deepest lineage, like kind of weaved into my bloodstream, like I can kind of feel it running through, is Taoism, and that way of like this very like coming back to nature mind, coming back to this play and delight of being like a babbling brook or being like yeah, there's almost this, there's a letting go of the restriction and contraction of the mind that has been formidable for us, of course, but it's also become this very yeah, it's moralizing. And I feel like a lot of that is also often sometimes like so deeply encoded in so many of our even like religious institutions. And
So
to be able to release that and to remember that like the divine is imminent. It's like in my laughter, in the laughter of a baby is actually this like wisdom that is life itself. To remember that.
it's like the
Yeah.
kind of Dalai Lama, you know, in the sense of you see this guy that laughs a lot. You know, it's like or the Zen ox herding pictures that it's kind of like an ordinary person that is kind of just alive in the marketplace. It's kind of I don't know. It's an old lesson, but that somehow the religious stricture has gone very deep, if you ask me. And maybe moralism is a defense where, you know, it's my first line of defense to be a moralist, where there's another level. There's what's behind that, you know, what's deeper than that.
Yeah. And it's true that it might also you need both. That's why we have all the archetypes. Like you need a kind of Saturnian way of being that is like I also appreciate the discipline that I can kind of rouse up. And there is and but it's all in the spirit of the dance. Like as you said, like Leela, it's like there's times where I am dancing with the archetype of a very moral activist, like, and it's not me, but it's like an arising of the sense of, oh, I want to do good in the world. There's like a sense of I do have a deep longing to be in integrity. And when I encounter being in a culture in a world where it's pushing me out of my integrity and I see the injustice, it's like I embrace the warrior, a very like moralistic warrior, you could say, that kind of like rises out from me. But also it's still part of the dance. Like it's like that warrior is just as much in relationship with the child and with the dancer and with the trickster. And I find that so much of soul making in the theater of soul making is this like willingness to kind of like in a sovereign, agentic, creative way, allow oneself to be possessed by these archetypes, but where you're conscious and intentional. It's like almost like you're allowing yourself to be with all of these different ways of engaging with the world. And in the end, it's like it's not about what's right. It's like it's more like what's beautiful, what's part of the dance, like where how do we want to be danced by reality right now?
Mm. And so, how do we become porous? How do we become open to this?
Mm, it's a beautiful, I mean, that question is actually an excellent lead into the oracular bodies research, which is really um I mean, for me, it's born out of my own soul curiosity, kind of like an autoethnography of my own porosity and what is the kind of nature of the oracular dimension of my being and knowing, but also knowing that I'm just one expression of that. Like there's so many, each of us have, like, I mean, I would say that our oracular porous energy body, the one that knows how to dance with the more than human and the imaginal realm, and this way of being able to read the synchronicities of the cosmos, this like magical mythopoetic way of being, it's latent in all of us. And some of us, like I think in my study and research, this phenomenological research project of interviewing oracular bodies, almost like as though they were the Oracle of Delphi, kind of coming to them and learning from them and knowing what they're here to transmit. And also the uniqueness of how they're intimate with the world and like just what is it like to be in that body? I mean, it's something that's both like in some ways dangerous. It's like with power comes a kind of great sense of responsibility. And to open yourself to such a porous way of being can feel dangerous to let in so much. There's an intimacy that you have to know how to attenuate as well. There's intensities that you need to know how to be in right relating with. But it's also like I mean, my sense is we're remembering that in ourselves. And we're kind of breaking through this modern skin, this constraint of we just have to be these rational beings. It's like we're not these only mental rational beings. Like to stay in the head when your whole body is this radical sensitive organ of perception that's always engaging in all of these ways and touching so many different dimensions of reality.
An
Uh,
instrument of perception as well, too, maybe, like,
yes.
the musical instrument of the body, we could say. But, while
Mhm.
you're talking there, I was thinking of the daemon as well, that each person is born with that something, uh, that peculiar something. But it's almost like, how much effort do we make to deny that peculiar in one way? Uh, but I think Hillman said something once like, sometimes if you bring your peculiarity in the world, you might get a surprise that people might like it. That, that it's kind of like, if we can be courageous enough to bring forth that hidden
Mm,
daemon, that latent seed which is there wanting to sprout, um, that may be
mm.
the very thing that a person's got. But then each person is, it seems to me, has something so different, something so. There's no two daemons that are the same, you know.
Yes. Yes. I mean, that for me to have like this kind of myriad, yeah, wave of soul awakening in that sense of all of these. I mean, it's as you were describing it, it's like all of these like infinitely unique shapes of our souls, like each one so radically different, each one just like actually impossible to put into any kind of conformist um yeah, like we would have to radically redesign all of our systems to be able to meet the teeming pluriversal reality that is that kind of demonic like explosion of difference. And it's so, and it kind of works against all of our modernist desires to box in and commodify and like, plug you in so we know how to be able to kind of fit everyone into a perfect cybernetic system. It's like, and that's the radical politics of soul work for me too, is that once you open up to that demonic uniqueness, that spark that is unique to each body and unique to each person, you can't get rid of, like, it's so hard to unsee. You can't get rid of it. It takes so
Um,
much.
it's like taking the
Yeah,
cork off the bottle or whatever. It's like, or the genie's come out of the bottle. Put it that way.
exactly. And then the culture that we create, the cultures that we create, I mean, even just on a very structural level, the kind of like civilizations, cities, like communities that we, and educational systems that we create out of that recognition that each of us has like a unique morphology, a shape, and it's always evolving and becoming as well. Like it would come, yeah, and that's where I get very excited about like that's the radical imagining of what could be possible, like a truly like yeah, it's like a system that's always morphing and adapting with us. Like we become a living part of the ecology.
Do you feel that it's happening with a lot of people? I mean, I don't really know how to think about this. Sometimes I listen to I've listened to someone on YouTube, and a little like you were saying earlier, there's the feeling of, through the language, there's some transmission of all these things, maybe that's a bit woo-woo for some people, but to speak like that. But it seems to me that there's so many people kind of uncorking the,
Mm,
letting the genie out of the bottle. But then I remember reading, a long, long time ago, maybe 20, 30 years ago, a book called The Cultural Creatives. And it was kind of, the idea behind it was, that, the 100th monkey idea, that if enough people, if that happens with enough people, that there's systems change, that there's kind of world change. But then it seems a little overly optimistic to me sometimes. Like, I might get a little bit, what is it, overly optimistic about the outcomes of things, that, there's this worldwide thing happening. But at the same
Mm.
time, I find it very inspiring by the amount of people that's happening to. And it is linked back to COVID. As something was in my world, at least, that kind of blanket that was put over us at COVID, that kind of little death thing that happened, somehow has kickstarted something in people. It kickstarted things in a lot of people, maybe.
Yes. I mean, it's hard not to, like, of course, there's a bias in my reality. Like I felt such, yeah, like a combination of both dissent and awakening through COVID. And a lot of it is just pausing. It's like we were forced to pause and be still. Like planes couldn't fly for a long time. Like there was actually this
No,
global,
no, no jumping on a plane to Paris. It's nothing like that. Yeah, forget that.
exactly. And that's unprecedented
Mm.
in kind of like modern human civilizational history. It's just this like collective knowing and also a shared transmission of that because we also have the internet and we're communicating about what it's like to be isolated. It's like everyone was suddenly put into like a meditation retreat, like a forced meditation retreat that probably felt more like prison than liberation.
Mm.
But I mean, in many ways, that kind of cocoon is it's like being able to see both the prison and the kind of liberation of that quality of stillness.
Those float tanks where people go and you kind of like you have sensory deprivation, and you sit in that float tank, but somehow it maybe takes you back to the self ultimately. But COVID was like a big float tank in my book, you know, which denied
Yeah.
which denied many normal things that we expected, many normal, uh, you know, to just jump in the car and go from there to there if you get bored or to, whatever. It's kind of like those kinds of things were interrupted.
Yes. I mean, you couldn't, yeah, like so much of it, this is also, I could imagine, and I remember Bayo writing about this too, like being able to, and it felt very provocative and daring for him to propose this, the idea that COVID, the pandemic could be seen as this goddess almost, like this more than human. Um, I don't remember exactly how he put it, but it did feel like there was a kind of transmission of wisdom, like we were being taught something through it. And to be able to welcome and integrate tragedy, because it was also a deeply tragic experience. Like many lives are lost. So many people went through levels of psychic isolation, social isolation that is, I mean, we don't like to even torture people through isolation. It's like we know what the impacts of that are. And yet at the same time, like there's a flowering forth of meaning. It's like, yeah, you can be, I mean, man's search for meaning. Like why is it that it's like in the deepest depths, like the cave and prison of despair, where somehow like this kind of relentless hope is able to blossom, like something
Mm.
that's indestructible.
Mm.
And it's not the case, of course, for every person, but
Mm.
for those who can, who want to be and kind of are guided by the light of the soul into that indestructible innocence.
Mm.
It's been a journey, I think, for many folks ever since. And I
Yeah.
agree with you. I don't have a naive, like I'm not optimistic insofar as I believe or project that we're definitely awake, like all these uncorked people are going to usher in some kind of new like age or something like that. But I also feel that, yeah,
There's something real happening.
there's something real happening, and you have to just be true to, like for me, it's just I have to be true to what I see and the world that I want to prefigure and embody for myself, for my relations, for my family, for my descendants. Yeah, and there is, I'm not, it's not an objective trend that I'm declaring as like a foresight, an analyst or something. Yeah.
I think there's this thing of saving the world. You know, it's quite strong, isn't it? Really, like this urge. But then sometimes I just think local. That just within your sphere. It's like there's that cliche. When you hear your sporting team, they say
Yes.
we can just focus on what's within our what is it? There's what's out of our control, and then we can just focus on kind of what's within our locus of control, and then it's kind of like both things happening. you know so if you go to the shop, well, then that's what's happening. You're going to the shop.
Yeah.
But Cheryl, just to go back for 1 second, I'm not sure we finished totally with your. Just let me get
Mm.
this straight about your project. You've gone out and spoken to a lot of people who who are opening. The way you're using oracular, I guess it means you see those as people who are opening to things at this time. So what would you say? What have you learned from speaking to all those different people? Is there one or two things that also come to mind?
Mm. And I'm taking a moment of pause because I'm noticing that once that particular, it's like the, I don't know what to call it, but that content stream of transmission from the oracular bodies, it's so fulsome. It's so like it's almost like the whole field was just saturated. And there's this, yeah, I mean, I think I'll start with the thread that is the most, yeah, it tugs, it's heart-wrenching for me. And because I think it's easy to kind of focus on the way, yeah, it's like the ways in which we want to, like, it's easy to pedestal the oracular body and to call them the prophet, the oracle, the mystic, the teacher,
Shaman.
the shaman, exactly. But so often it's like these oracular bodies, these oracular beings, like they don't want to be in public view. There's actually a way in which like and I was really looking at bodies like Bios as well, or Sophie Strand and others. It's like there's a way in which the gaze of the public can actually be incredibly damaging to the oracular body. And it's intensely amplified by our attentional media landscape. It's like if you are someone who is a kind of social public figure on the internet, like the immediacy with which you are projected upon either as like an angel or as a demon in the next day, um, is like profoundly painful for any person to experience, but for an oracular body is even more so. So I think something that was um, that felt very important about this work was to honor their sensitivity and to honor the vulnerability of being so porous, and to honor the fact that often these beings lived at the edges of villages by the forest and are mostly keeping to themselves because they have to cultivate the kind of quietude and ways of relating with the trees, with the rivers, with the stars, so that they can hear and listen to the subtle. So I think what I was noticing was the kind of profound care that arose in me, almost like a protect, like the work that I'm doing in the research is also about like creating this infrastructure of care for the oracular. So not simply, finding these celebrity prophets and then being like, tell us your wisdom, but actually, what are quiet and what are really deeply nourishing ways we can actually support these beings that allow them to like live well, be well in their bodies, kind of like show up when they feel called to, but they're not prophets on demand. They're not yeah, they're
Paper,
not
paper
commodified again.
view.
Yes.
Mm,
Yeah. And often for them, I'm, like even shamans need to like it's like they need to survive
mm,
and live in a late capitalist world. So I think yeah, it's like ways in which these oracular bodies have to hold the tension of being in integrity with their values and with like really their connection to source, like to cosmos, to this way of feeling in line with the Tao, like whatever you call it. And then also needing to pay rent and needing to survive, because we also don't have cultures where we feed our monks, where we kind of like, yeah, we don't take care of our oracles anymore.
mm,
So yeah, that's one thing that comes up. That's just kind of like the heart,
mm.
um,
Yeah,
and care.
that's good. That's good. And I just, you know, um, I know we've been talking for some time now. Something about the mystery. Tell us something about the mystery. I've always liked in Jung, just kind of revealing
Mhm.
where I'm coming from, the mysterium tremendum that, and I think we've spoken about this through this conversation really, but it's kind of like, it's not only that opening to the wonder, but the tremendum, tremendous originally meant it might shake you up a bit. It might uh, have some shock. It's kind of like there's an awe there, which is the sacred is big, you know, and
Mhm.
it has that kind of effect. But there's also this thing of some liberation, it seems, through this mystery that's larger than ourselves, through this kind of divine mystery where there are synchronicities, where um, there's
Mm.
something at play which we don't have to kind of nut the whole thing out.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I asked you the question and then I went off into
No, I thank you. Also,
how
it's
would
funny
you?
'cause when you asked about the mystery, there was an immediate like you know, that line, like the Tao that can be named is not the Tao. It's like the mystery that can be named is not the mystery. And at the same time, like we poetically gesture to the mystery. We dance with the mystery. And as you were sharing actually, and I appreciated being invited into your dance was that way of surrendering to a kind of groundless ground of mystery. Like and actually this is another thread that I'm pulling from the research on oracular bodies. It's there's always this tension between longing and desire and actually discernment and clarification. So, and this is like, you know, it's acutely the case for an oracular body, but every person navigates the world like this. You are like motivated and moved by attraction, and then you're also always discerning and clarifying like what is it that's actually mine to do and how do I pause, hold back. But the thing that is actually quite um profound to practice the remembrance of is that deep ground of mystery that's always holding us. And that's the real transmission, that's the true transmission, no matter what wisdom tradition you come from. It's this remembrance of God, of mystery, of source, of cosmos. And it doesn't mean that you're just, you know, you're completely shielded or protected from the difficulties and challenges and tragedies of aliveness, but there is this way in which like humans long to feel this kind of beyond sense, like faith that we are held in a kind of meaningfulness beyond our knowing.
Mm,
And that even when I'm profoundly suffering, that there is a sense of meaning to that. And yeah, I've heard it described like there's this kind of cultural anthropologist, philosopher, Jean Gebser, who calls it primordial trust. Like if you are really able to cultivate this deep sense of primal, primordial trust, it's like you can actually weather anything because there's this sense of I'm being held by Mother Cosmos. I've heard it described as also like secure attachment to reality. Like enlightenment, awakening is just secure attachment to reality. And this capacity again to just like be with the profound mystery and the spaciousness of that knowing that you are not in control and you are held in the weave of something far greater than yourself. So, and that for me, like that's like you can describe it, you can speak to it, but that's like to tune into that knowing in your body is the most, it's like coming home to yourself.
mm,
It's coming home back to your body, coming
yeah.
back home to the cosmos.
You know, I was thinking as you were saying that it's like that desire for that for home, you know, that's one of the most primary desires. And I really liked what you were saying about that. Who was it? Gebser, the trust, the primary trust.
Mm.
Uh, it's uh, in my world there are religious longings, whether we believe that or not. You know, one of those primal ones is that sort of longing for that home to be held in that home.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's probably a nice place to leave things, Cheryl. But I just want to say one thing. I mean, that I know you're giving birth very soon. Can we finish by just you tell us uh, what's happening because you're about to give birth very soon, aren't you?
Yes. Um, yeah, I'm a week away from the prescribed due date, which is um, which means that it could happen at any point. Yeah, it's I mean, even having this conversation in the kind of precipice of something that is so mundane and so miraculous, like to become a parent, to give birth, I think something, because I've been going through this kind of like psychic biological pregnancy and gestation process for the past 9 months. And in many ways, like I actually, before I, this is my first pregnancy, is my first child, but before like this, the kind of pattern, this archetypal pattern of birth and this way of like allowing the seed to enter you and to then nourish and grow and then ultimately allow what is yours to create to come into the world and then to steward it into the world. It's been such a powerful metaphor. Um, but now to have that primal pattern be actually kind of like viscerally through flesh and blood um, happening in the living biome of my body. I mean, I find it so connecting where on the one hand, it's the most intense, you could say a kind of like awakening process that I've never known before. Far more intense, far more intimate than, yeah, anything I've experienced sitting on a meditation cushion.
Yeah,
And then it's also so mundane. It's like my mom did it, my grandmother did it, my friends,
yeah,
like it's everyone here born into the world came through this process.
yeah,
So yeah, there's something of it's the kind of deep connection to a continuity of the sacred in the mundane.
mm,
Um, feels very humbling and also gives me a lot of hope. It's like,
mm.
yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Well, what would have happened if you had it like if it had happened while we were doing this podcast? We would have just had to, like, you would have just run out the door, grabbed the car keys. See you later. No, it's all good. No, that's lovely. And thanks for taking the time to share all of those things today.
Oh, I appreciate it. This is a beautiful, soulful conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl.